Over the last 30 years, Friends of Great Salt Lake has worked to protect this dynamic ecosystem. That tenacity and endurance informs our perspective and approach. We find common ground with diverse stakeholders, industry, political leaders, waterfowlers, scientists, artists, and we contribute those talents on behalf of a shared vision for a healthy Great Salt Lake.
Well, on the board of Friends of Great Salt Lake, just like it is in the society that we live, so it's pretty diverse. Everybody has their own things that are important. While we may not have the same opinion about things, we all have the same goal, and that goal is to protect this lake.
We've built relationships and trust with our partners that have translated into significant outcomes for the lake. We advocate for scientifically sound policies and defend the lake through legal challenges.
So we have three facets of the advocacy program. We have water quantity, which is obviously an issue, water quality, and then encroachment or development. When we make a decision about whether we're going to bring a challenge, our touchstone is, what does the science show? Does the science show that something is going to harm the lake? If it does, then that basically makes the decision for us. Yes, we've had some court battles, and yes, we've come out on top in some of those. Some of them we haven't. But the fact that we are willing to say, look, we've got a problem with that, because we've been doing it for so long, people tend to listen.
The future of the lake depends on people, us, all of us becoming involved, doing everything we can to make this thing survive. Advocating for the lake makes me feel proud.
It is my honor and my privilege to be the attorney for the lake. It's meaningful to me. And it's meaningful to help and preserve something for my grandkids and their kids for years to come, so that they can be part of something that, you know, I've had the privilege to be part of.
I don't know how to pull up the presentation though, sadly. So
Looks like people are still making their way over.
Okay. Sadly, every time I see a computer, I freak out.
I can't. You can't.
Hi everyone, please find a seat. Thanks everyone for rejoining us. We have a great afternoon lined up with birds, ecology, and all sorts of fun topics. I just did want to remind you that this evening we have our poster session that takes place from 5 to 7, 5:30 to 7. That's a really fun time, so please do. Beer and wine, yeah. I've been, once again, I'm talking about alcoholic beverages up here. So please do join us. There's some really spectacular posters. I've really enjoyed looking at them over the last day and a half. So right now we have a great presentation on shorebirds from Max Malmquist, Sharon Montecino, and M. Clark. So come on up, and thanks again for joining us after lunch.
All right, you guys. Lynn convinced me to tell a joke. I'm not very good at joke telling, but what is a snowy plover's favorite tool? Anyone?
A northern shoveler.
Pliers. Pliers? All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you to Friends of Great Salt Lake and to Lynn for inviting us back to present on the Intermountain West Shorebird surveys. We presented on this project at the last forum when we just had a few seasons under our belt, but here we are now, and the data is in. It's no longer preliminary, and Sharon has analyzed the data, so you get to see some of that today. And we're excited to share with you what 5 years of counting shorebirds across the Pacific Flyway has taught us. And for those of you who do not know about this program, the Intermountain West, or the interior portion of the Pacific Flyway, is incredibly important to shorebirds, providing crucial stopover and breeding habitat and food resources for millions of migratory shorebirds each year. And we're replicating a survey that was conducted from 1989 to 1995, which was the first and only time until now that systematic surveys for migratory shorebirds have been conducted in this region. And in that early 90s effort, they surveyed over 160 sites across the West during peak spring and fall shorebird migration. And over the past 5 years, we have not only surveyed those same sites that were included in the 90s, but we've expanded to cover well over 200 sites across 11 Western states since August of 2022. And everyone here knows this very well, but Great Salt Lake and the rest of the West has experienced dramatic changes in surface water availability, drought, climatic changes over the last 3 decades. And with the long-term declining trends at Great Salt Lake, it's important for us to understand how the birds, their populations, distributions, and habitats have changed over time. And we started this program in August of 2022, which of course was peak of the mega drought and when Great Salt Lake reached its historic low. And here we are again in 2026 in a very precarious position, as Commissioner Ferry alluded to yesterday, with record-breaking low snowpack and with the lake currently only at 1492 feet in elevation. And with much of the West experiencing drought and with a hot and dry summer coming in the next few months, this is a very important time to, for us to be monitoring shorebirds. And over millennia, shorebirds have relied on this network of wetland habitats and saline lakes like Great Salt Lake to stop and rest and refuel on their long migratory journeys. And without places like Great Salt Lake, birds like this Wilson's phalarope wouldn't have the habitat and food resources like brine flies that they need to help them survive their migratory journeys. And the overarching goal of this program is to evaluate shorebird distribution and abundance at Great Salt Lake and across the region to provide a foundation for the management of resources for shorebirds. And while we're surveying over 200 sites in 11 western states, Utah has 6 sites that are part of this program, including Great Salt Lake. And Great Salt Lake is just one site, covering an area about the size of Rhode Island. And working with the Division of Wildlife Resources, we've broken the lake down into over 60 sub-sites or sub-areas. And each season we do our best to survey the entire lake all in one day. And in order to achieve this, we have an amazing flock of over 130 birders, volunteers, biologists, duck club members who survey by foot, by airplane, by airboat. And we could not accomplish this without the dedication of so many people and without the coordination and leadership of our partners like Sageland Collaborative and the Division of Wildlife. And with that, I'll turn it over to Em.
Thanks, Max. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of our recent results. So we just finished our 8th survey, their spring 2026 survey last week. Unfortunately, we don't have all of those data compiled yet. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about our fall migration 2025 surveys. We counted over a quarter of a million birds across the Utah survey sites. And the most abundant of those was the American avocet, which had over 125,000 individuals counted. The next most abundant categories are the Wilson's phalarope and redneck phalarope. These birds are in high numbers on their own, but also we do have an issue with a large number of unidentified phalaropes, as they can be very difficult to tell apart at different times. And so altogether, those birds totaled about 86,000 individuals. In addition to the large numbers of shorebirds, our survey does a great job of picking up some finer scale data. So we are able to pick up rare migrants like red knot and ruddy turnstone. This map shows the abundance and distribution of where the shorebirds are and what habitats they're using across our survey areas. The lighter colors represent lower abundances, and the darker colors are the higher abundance areas. So this map is showing the really dark blue areas is the area around Farmington Bay, and this tends to have the highest aggregations of our shorebirds. I will point out that this map is specific for our last survey in the fall. However, the distribution is very similar across the fall seasons, and it changes slightly during the spring, but in general, this is where we're seeing the largest numbers of birds. So we have a variety of different management entities that are responsible for the lands that the shorebirds are on. And so the very large percent is on sovereign lands managed by Division of Forestry Fire State Lands, with over 80% of the shorebirds counted there. The next most abundant, with just over 9%, is from the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources lands. And then the next most abundant is the private duck clubs support large numbers of shorebirds, with just about 6% of the total count. So a variety of state and public lands, private lands are all important for shorebird habitat. This is especially important as shorebirds are one of the fastest declining taxa of birds. And so this was taken into account with the 2025 revision of Utah's State Wildlife Action Plan. They identified a number of shorebird species as species of greatest conservation concern, as well as this year, last year, they developed a species of greatest information need list. So these are all birds that we're trying to get more data on in Utah to make sure we know what's going on with them to help inform management decisions. So you can see the name of the shorebird species on the left, and then which category they fall in, and then the most recent count from the fall 2025 surveys, as well as which specific survey area we're finding the majority of these birds in, which is all really important to help us target our management to better support these birds. Taking a closer look at some of our priority species. This map, again, is the abundance and distribution for American avocet. You can see it looks very similar to the total count map because they are the most abundant species. So they're utilizing the Farmington Bay area the most. This is their preferred shallow water habitat where they're finding lots of food. You can see from the next map, this is the combination of red-necked and Wilson's phalaropes, and so the distribution here changes a little bit. And again, these birds are looking largely for the brine flies, so they'll be moving around the lake more, but we see them in very high numbers along the Antelope Island Causeway. That's that little sliver there with that dark blue, as well as they were in the water surrounding Carrington Island is where we had the highest abundances. But when we take a look at snowy plover, which is another species of greatest conservation need, you can see there's a very different areas that they're utilizing. And so these birds prefer the playa and mudflat habitats. So the south shore of Great Salt Lake is incredibly important for them. And so we need to take into account that shorebirds are using a wide variety of different habitats because they have very different foraging tactics. And so all of this needs to be taken into consideration as we're considering how to best manage for these birds. Finally, I wanted to share just a map showing counts across the region from the last fall migration survey. This is to exemplify how important the Great Salt Lake specifically is for shorebirds. This map shows all the different sites that we're surveying with the lower colors and smaller circles with less shorebirds, and you can see the larger circle is the greatest abundance of shorebirds. So Great Salt Lake, the Greater Salt Lake ecosystem supported over 270,000 shorebirds, while the next most abundant with over 100,000 was at Salton Sea in Southern California. So Great Salt Lake is just essential for shorebirds. And now I'm going to have Sharon tell us a little bit more about how the results have changed over time and across the region.
Thank you, Em. Over the past 2 years, we conducted a study to understand the impact of environmental changes on shorebird populations, growing on the counts and the available information from the Intermountain West shorebird surveys. And this research was my master's thesis at Utah State University, guided by Dr. T.J. Clark-Wolf. And the main goal was to analyze the dynamics of shorebird populations related to their abundance and distribution across the Intermountain West, and by quantifying the population changes and trying to identify the main factors driving those changes. The most abundant species were American avocet, followed by Les and Western sandpipers, and Wilson's phalarope, red-necked phalarope, and black-necked stilt. Among the sandpipers, Les and Western sandpiper accounted for over 86% of the total individuals. And among plovers, killdeer accounted for 62%, and the snowy plover for 20% of the total individual in these taxonomic groups. This analysis comparing the historical and the current surveys included nearly 7 million of total shorebirds over the years across the entire region, counting on 160 sites. And when we focus only on the period from 2022 to 2025, the most recent period of surveys, we observed that shorebirds populations varied seasonally, with higher counts in fall. And despite including more than 100 additional sites in the recent period compared to the historical surveys, we can see the American avocet and black-necked stilt remain among the most abundant species. However, the highest in this recent period were phalaropes. The overall percent change between the historical and the recent surveys, it means considering all the species and all the sites, indicate a decrease of about 37% in fall and about 54% of shorebirds migrating through the Intermountain West in spring. And this map shows the distribution of the sites which have increased the abundances of shorebirds and the sites that have declined. And as we can see, the most sites have indeed experienced declines, and only a few of them support more birds now than 30 years ago. We can see the detail for the Great Salt Lake, and both seasons, fall and also spring, are showing decreases in the shorebird abundances. When we look at the taxonomic groups level, most groups also decline, with howitzers and avocets experiencing the steepest decreases. And the red asterisk in these graphs shows the significance, and for example, phalaropes as a group showed an increase during spring, relative to the historical period, but the estimate, as you can see, is uncertain because the confidence intervals were very wide, in a range among 30 to 500% difference. So, yeah, and additionally for Phalarops on fall, the model was not even significant. And the same for yellowlegs, model was not significant, so we cannot specify if they are increasing or decreasing as the graph shows. Some important details about Phalarops in this context are that many individuals were recorded as unidentified species, as M indicates before. During these surveys, about 800,000 individuals of Phalarops were unidentified species. It means not sure if they were redneck Phalarops or Wilson's Phalarops. And for Wilson Phalarops, this species was not included in the historical analysis that Schuford et al. Did for the historical surveys, because their timing of migration is different and it doesn't match the survey dates that we are conducting in the Intermountain West Shorebird survey. So this methodology works very well for most of shorebirds migrating through the region, but especially for Wilson's Phalarops, which is considered as an early migrant, doesn't match very well the dates. So, and these are the mean counts for redneck Phalarops, whose migration timing aligns a bit better with the Intermountain West Shorebird survey dates. And given that, it's likely that redneck Phalarops is really driving the increases that we could see before in spring. And additionally, it's important to consider the time frame for this kind of analysis. If we look at the total count during our surveys, it looks as if Wilson's Phalarops slightly increase, but surveys of the mid-80s that we can see in the right side of the screen normally reach it between 500 to 600,000 individuals. And our higher counts never reach over 200,000 individuals. There is a specific group, the Phalarop Working Group, is conducting some surveys, Phalarop-specific surveys, at key staging sites, trying to account for those details and methodologies that really can match and get better, account better for the abundance of this specific taxonomy group. And some examples for some, other species also showed considerable variation among the different states. We can see in the y-axis in this graph that, for example, for American avocet, Utah has the higher abundances, the largest population of this species. And the difference, the decline in this case between the two periods is even greater in Utah than in other states, unfortunately. And these are the data for the same species, but across the entire Intermountain West. So this just is for making it easier to visualize the percent change than the model was indicating before. And we can see the changes between the historical period in blue and the recent years of surveys in the orange. Something similar was observed for blackneck stilt with a steep decline in its population during these two periods. Regarding the sites, most of shorebirds were counted on only 9 sites per period. And together they accounted for more than 91% of the total shorebirds during the surveys. And most of them, as you can see, are saline lakes or include some saline lakes, for example, as La Hontan Valley, which is a complex of wetlands, which includes Carson Lake. And only 3 saline lakes, only 3 of them are accounting for more than 75% of the total shorebirds migrating through this region. And the Great Salt Lake, as you can see in both graphs, in both periods, holds over 50% of the total populations. So something interesting here, it's also give us a sense of hope, is that sites such as Owens Lake, for example, which significantly increased the water levels during this period, during the past 3 decades, as part of a dust mitigation program, rose from supporting 0.3% of shorebirds population to 6.6% in the recent period, of 6.6% of the total shorebirds migrating through Intermountain West, showing that after recovery, the return of flowing water once again provides habitat for shorebirds and for waterbirds communities. The percent change in surface water levels also shows overall decrease over the past 30 years. And however, a few sites increases over 1,000% the water extent. Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. We also found that 47 sites held over 1,000 shorebirds in the historical period. However, 24 of them no longer sustain those quantities of shorebirds. And 18 new sites do so in the recent period. You can see the details in the different colors over this map. And you can see the distribution of these sites on the map. Among the new sites that meet the criteria of the 1,000 shorebirds in the recent period, but did not in the past, most of them have significantly increases the surface water levels. Again, showing the importance of water for shorebirds, especially in the context of these arid and semi-arid regions. And finally, according to the drivers of these changes, the strongest predictors of shorebird abundances were the surface water, the mean temperature, wetland isolation, and the proximity of the survey dates related to the peak migration dates for each species at each site. And greater water extent and higher mean temperature were associated with higher shorebird abundances, while more isolated wetlands or less connected to the neighbor wetlands were associated with lower abundances. So some takeaways about this research, we could see that still common and widespread species are declining. American avocet, black-necked stilt, and dowitchers are among the most abundant species across the entire Pacific America's flyway, yet have experienced the steepest declines, averaging about of over 65%. Also, 7 of the 9 key sites in the recent period, the sites that hold over 90% of shorebirds migrating in this region, are saline lakes, and 3 of them are accounting for 3/4 of the total individuals. So these findings suggest the saline lakes are critical for shorebirds in this region, and also that these significant increases in surface water may create or restore suitable habitat, as we could see in the example for Owens Lake and also Owens Lake in California, but also in some other states. Wilcox Playa in Arizona, Antelope Reservoir in Oregon, among others. So under increasingly uncertain climatic and hydrological conditions, the concentration of these large numbers of individuals in a few sites may amplify rather than buffer the exposure to environmental risk. And we found that about 75% of the shorebirds were aggregated in a few sites 30 years ago. And they are still doing so in the same stopover sites during these past 5 years of surveys. And these findings are consistent with previous studies that identify the surface water extent as a key factor of the wetland function, but also a key factor for turbid abundances. And however, the flooding across these sites may reflect not only differences in the extent of the water bodies, but also in the depth. And that was a factor that we didn't study during this research. So yeah, these results finally show that shorebird conservation in the Intermountain West should prioritize protecting these key sites and managing them, but also it's very important increasing the overall densities of wetlands and the connectivity between them, because we could see that wetland isolation was negatively affecting shorebird abundances. So this might improve the resilience to the environmental changes and mitigating the temporary or permanent loss of key resources for shorebirds, such as food or shelter. And what's next, Max?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Looking ahead, so we just finished our spring survey window last week, and that was our final full planned regional survey for this program. However, we recognizing the importance of these key sites, we have scheduled surveys at those sites this coming fall to keep our finger on the pulse of shorebird populations as we experience extreme drought in states like Utah, Nevada, and Oregon. And we're also working on a plan for potential long-term monitoring at these key sites as well. Sharon is going to be working on a publication with her analysis from her thesis, and we're also looking at additional analyses to help inform management and make recommendations for priority shorebird species and priority sites. Also correlating Phragmites management efforts with the response from shorebirds. We're also in conversation with Jeff Richards to look at a pilot of adaptive management during shoulder seasons at one of the duck clubs. And we have an incredible network of over 70 partner organizations that have helped make this project or this program possible. And we really want to thank them and to everyone who has helped fund this program, including here in Utah, Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands, and a huge thank you to the Division of Wildlife and the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program. We could not have accomplished what we have without each and every one of those who have contributed. So thank you. And I think we have time maybe for one question if anyone has, and we're always happy to chat with you guys afterwards as well. All right. Oh.
Do we know what is happening with these bird populations to the south of us? I mean, similar surveys for South America, and is it just a total decline of these populations? Do you know?
So some of our partners, Point Blue Conservation Science, they have, it's called the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey. And they've actually been conducting that survey along the Pacific coast, I think from Alaska all the way down to Chile. For, I think, since 2012, maybe. They actually just put out a publication, and it's showing similar declines in species like avocets. I think avocets were one of the species in their publication that showed steep declines. But, I think that's one of the tricky things with shorebirds is a lot of these birds are using the entire flyway and the entire hemisphere for different parts of their annual cycle. And, where is it that these birds are actually experiencing declines? Is it because of lack of nesting or loss of nesting habitat or food resources on their breeding grounds? I think, one of the interesting things that Sharon showed us here is our local breeders, blackneck stilts and American avocets. Historically, Great Salt Lake has supported 50% of the global breeding and staging population of American avocets. And I think that maybe tells you a little bit about what's happening with their habitat here at Great Salt Lake. Great, thank you guys.
Belovsky, University of Notre Dame, been doing research with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources since 1994. On the Great Salt Lake, and I'd like to talk today about a problem that has caught our attention that's just possibly starting to emerge. And I'd like to start with what I spoke with at the last Friends meeting, and that is last time I talked to you about how we were studying decomposition of different biotic materials in Great Salt Lake water to try to get an understanding of nutrient cycles in the south arm of the lake. And this work involved looking at how quickly different materials, shrimp bodies, shrimp feces, brine fly bodies, etc., decompose in lake water in the laboratory at different temperatures, salinities. And we then related that also to how quickly those materials settled in the lake water and turned over in the lake water. We looked at their nutrient content for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And then we figured out where in the lake different amounts of that material from each of those biotic bodies was released. And in doing that, we're able to put together a nutrient budget for the lake for a number of regions: the pelagic zone, the microbialite benthic zone, and also the benthic zones in the pelagic region. Doing this, we were then able to see if those numbers that we generated matched up with measurements within the lake. First of all, the budgets that we created ended up balancing. Has to happen. If they don't balance, you're losing nutrients at some place and not accounting for them. So they balanced, and that was good to start with. Next thing we knew from Christine Rumsey's work, that the amount of material that went into sediment traps that she had out in the lake in June and July was about 2.3 grams per meter squared per day. Our budget estimated that just alone the shrimp fecal pellet snowfall is what marine biologists called the settling out of poop from zooplankton. Snowfall that we would get from the brine shrimp was 1.9 grams per meter squared per day. Pretty close. The observed total dissolved nitrogen predicted or observed in the lake average over the year was 4.21 milligrams per liter. The budget that we estimated was 4.15 milligrams per liter. Pretty close. And for phosphorus, we observed 0.295 milligrams of phosphorus per liter, milligrams per liter, versus a prediction of 0.26 milligrams per liter. Oh boy, the nutrient cycling model seemed to work. However, we didn't consider one thing. And the thing we didn't consider in making this budget was the flow of water from the south arm of the lake into the north arm and the return of north arm water to the south arm. And how that flux, that flow of water between the two arms might be affecting the nutrient budget in the lake. Now, from 1994, when we started working on these projects, we figured the North Arm didn't have any impact at all. It wasn't worth studying. It was just dead water, a salt pond. And that was a mistake. What we did find is that this flow of water, and let's just say through the breach in the causeway, is taking a large amount of water from the South Arm into the North Arm, and a smaller amount of water from the North Arm into the South Arm. And interestingly, for years, and I wish we had more data, for years in which we have flows of water from each of the arms between, say, from south to north and north to south, we have it for every month of the year. We could calculate how much is going, and you see that a lot of water is going from the South Arm into the North Arm. This is a ratio, a flow from north to south, south to north. Later, since about 2023, that flow from the north to the South Arm has virtually become zero. They've become separated, not linked together. Well, using this, and I want to apologize, I'm not a hydrologist. Just on the basis of that relative flow from north to south, I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations on what this was going to do to the nutrient cycling in the South Arm and in the North Arm. Now, prior to this decline, and the decline in the flow to near zero from the north to the south, occurred with the construction of the berm. Berm was a great solution to solving the salinity problems that were appearing in the lake, where the salinity was getting too high in the South Arm because of the drought. But now, by not letting North Arm water, which is high in salinity, back into the South Arm, it solved that problem on a short-term basis. But now we're getting no nutrient cycling coming back. This short-term, let's see, this one slide too many. This nutrient cycling and back-of-the-envelope calculations leads to the North Arm having a higher nitrogen content. Let's just talk about nitrogen because that's the limiting nutrient for the phytoplankton growth in the South Arm. This leads to a higher nitrogen concentration in the North Arm than in the South Arm. And looking at these buckets, with 25% of the concentration of the South Arm moving to the North Arm and 7% going to the South Arm, pre-berm period, we would see that you'd have 4.15 milligrams per liter in the South Arm, which is what the nutrient budget came up with. The nitrogen concentration in the North Arm is 9.96 milligrams per liter when it comes to an equilibrium. So in other words, the nutrient budget pre-berm is basically being maintained by losing some nitrogen to the North Arm, concentrating in the North Arm, and then that being returned to the South Arm to maintain the 4.15 milligrams per liter. This number here is very similar to what Christine Rumsey and USGS has come up, as I pointed out. They're 4.2 some milligrams per liter. And they find that the North Arm water is somewhere between 2 and 3 times more concentrated in nitrogen than the South Arm water, and that's what you get here from these calculations. Now let's see what happens when we put in the berm. 25% water goes from the south arm to the north arm, but only 0.3% of the south arm water returns to the only 0.3% of the north arm water returns to the south. No equilibrium is attained. Now, I don't believe that there probably isn't an equilibrium, but what this means is over time, generally, that nitrogen is lost to the north arm and is not recovered. Just with 2 years, with the berm being raised in the causeway, the nitrogen content in the south arm declines from 4.15 to 3.78 milligrams per liter. The observed over the 2 years was 3.9 milligrams per liter in the south arm. That's what the decline was measured as by USGS. That is, for a 2-year period, a decline of 12.5% of the nitrogen in the south arm, just for 2 years. In the north arm, the nitrogen concentration goes up to 10.95 milligrams per liter, which is a 2.9 times increase, and that is what roughly may be occurring from the limited measurements that we've got comparing north to south arm water. This is not good, and it raises the question of what's going to happen in the south arm as nitrogen continually declines because not enough water from the north arm is now returning to the south arm. Okay, so this is what made us concerned. Here's the chlorophyll A as a measure of phytoplankton abundance in the south arm, measured over this period from 1994 and then the last 2022 and 2023. Very similar. No berm. Here's the chlorophyll A measured after the berm was raised. And you can see it's declined, and it's statistically significantly declined that's taken place. The phytoplankton aren't as productive now as they once were in the south arm. And remember, in the south arm, that is what supports the shrimp populations, phytoplankton production. An interesting thing that emerged when we saw this, and we started to worry about the possibility of nitrogen not returning when we saw this return of these measurements in the south arm of the lake. One thing that we looked at was the chlorophyll content of the cells of Denaliella, the dominant phytoplankton species in the south arm. Prior to raising the berm, the green line here by month shows how the chlorophyll content in Denaliella cells changes. The brown line here represents what happened to the chlorophyll content of the Denaliella cells after the berm was raised. In other words, this is telling us that those phytoplankton cells are less nutritious to a brine shrimp eating them. And this matches up with studies that have been done with Denaliella in the laboratory that have been published by other people using chemostat studies where they varied the nutrient content, the nitrogen available to the Denaliella. And when there's no berm, it comes out that the chlorophyll content of those cells is very similar to what those studies came up with as the range of chlorophyll per cell. When the berm is there, look how much it has dropped. A large drop in the chlorophyll content per cell. Well, what can we predict is going to happen as a result of these changes in nitrogen availability in the south arm? Well, as I talked about at the last Friends meeting, I've been building a ecosystem computer model, and we can put in the salinity change that everybody was worried about, which is the 2022 salinity values. We can put in a 6% annual decrease in nitrogen availability, and we can look at both. And it predicts what's going to happen. And let's look at a few of these results in detail. If nitrogen declines 6% per year, and we look at that for 2 years, so 12% decline total, you can see here that the harvesters get more brine shrimp cysts with the nitrogen decline than what this is observed, and this is what's predicted by the model, but you can see cyst production for the harvesters increases. Very simply, if you're a brine shrimp and you have less food, you say the environment's not good. I need to produce cysts, which can be dormant for a period of time, so that when they hatch, things might be better. You don't produce live young. You invest in the future, not in the present. Well, you might say, oh, wow, the harvesters may want to see this. Well, it turns out, though, that the product here may be going down in quality in terms of the economics because it takes longer. The hatching of those cysts doesn't occur as rapidly, and that is not good for the market people who want in aquaculture to be able to hatch the cysts very quickly. So more cysts doesn't necessarily mean a better product or more of a good product. Poor grebes, shrimp numbers go down. Poor shorebirds, brine fly larvae go down, which they're going to feed on, and with the flies that would eventually emerge from those. If we look at nitrogen and salinity declines, salinity increase and a nitrogen decline at 6% per year, see a better fit between the black, which is predicted, and the observed, and that would be for the period 2022 through 2025. So what this is telling us, it's not just salinity that's the concern. We have to be worried about now we've decreased nitrogen in the South Arm by preventing salinity from increasing. Now, you could say, well, 6% per year is no big deal. The problem is that's 6% every year. It's additive. 1 year, 6% decline. 2 years, 12%. 3 years, 18% decline. 4 years, 24% decline, on and on. And you can use the model to project what's going to happen, and eventually the cyst abundance for the harvesters starts to go down. Phytoplankton go down, shrimp go down regularly over time. This is for 5 years. Salinity, on the other hand, levels off in all cases. Once you hit 180 and hold it at 180, you get the same results. It doesn't continue to go down. It stabilizes. It gets accentuated, though, when you combine the 180 with that nitrogen decline. You can see things go down much more rapidly. So 180 is not good, and match that up with a decline in nitrogen, and you get much worse conditions. The berm solved the salinity problem, but it created another problem. Okay, so what this tells us, we were wrong completely. The North and South Arms are linked systems. We can't ignore the North Arm. Next, return of North Arm water is important to the South Arm nutrient balances. The berm helped to manage salinity. It was a great short-term solution, but it strongly impacts the South Arm nutrients, reducing them. It's one of these management things that doing one thing changes something else in an unanticipated way, and you have to respond to it. This will differentially impact the harvest and the birds. At least in the short term, the harvest of cis seems to be at least stable. But we are decreasing the food resources for birds, both shorebirds and the grebes. So what this tells us is periodic stresses are going to change these balances in terms of nutrients within the lake because of changing flows between the north and south arm. Without a berm, those things would be changing periodically, but not to the extent that the berm has literally shut off the return of nutrients to the south arm. And this requires timely reporting of the flows from north to south and south to north. And the problem is we don't have that. Most of the data that we have, except for those few years that I showed you, somebody or USGS or somebody else measured the flow, let's say, at the peak time of the year. Well, that's great, but they didn't measure it at the low times of the flows. And so you don't get an annual change. So this has to be done on a regular basis. Now, to show my age, and I know there's some of you out in the audience that'll remember this, in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a television commercial for margarine. And there was margarine out there, and they gave it to Mother Nature to taste the margarine, and she said, "Oh, my sweet creamery butter." And then the announcer said, "No, this is such and such margarine." It was chiffon, by the way. And she then responds, and I hope this plays the sound.
It's not nice to fool Mother Nature.
It's not loud enough. She responds, "It's not nice to fool Mother Nature," and then there's lightning, earthquakes, and everything around her dies. What this is telling us is that it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. We do something in terms of management, and it creates an additional problem that we have to face. And the berm was a good solution. I'm not arguing against the berm. Salinity was an immediate problem we had to address. But we didn't anticipate that there could be repercussions of changing the flow between the north and south arm. And that is now what seems to be important. Thank you. I think I have a few minutes for questions. Any questions? Gee, Wayne, I knew you were going to ask something.
Hey, you're in my wheelhouse right now. Hey, previously when the lake was deeper, I believe I'd calculated the majority of the nutrients in the water column anyway were in the deep brine layer, not in the mixed layer. So how, I don't know or even if we have a deep brine layer right, well, no, I guess we don't.
We don't.
Now that the berm's in. But how does that fit into your, comparing your earlier data to the recent data?
Well, the deep brine layer has a different advection release of the nutrients from that into the upper layer. And that was built into that particular model as about 7 years, I think it was, to release. And that's based on some of your data and some other data that we had in terms of turnover of the deep brine layer. Not the benthos that isn't in the deep brine layer is turning over on, I think, a 2-year basis or something like that in that the benthos. Now the problem is, this would be a great, somebody asked me this question last night. What happened when the causeway was being repaired and there was no breach at all at that period? The problem with that, and I said, I wish I could have analyzed it and we could see that same process taking place. The problem is that when they cut off the flow in the repair, the deep brine layer disappeared and all those nutrients were then allowed to come back up into the water column. So it's not a clear-cut case. That was the problem.
Hi, great talk. When the breach was open, is there any idea of how much nutrients or nitrogen from rivers inflow it's just streaking across the causeway and then funneling directly up into the north arm without time to mix in the south arm.
Yeah, well, interesting question. You know, what I said, this is back of the envelope calculations. This is so simplistic. Literally, it's an Excel spreadsheet, one time, just based on that flow across the breach. What it looks like, and this was an argument going back to 1994 when we started working on these projects. How much of the nitrogen coming in from inflows from streams was affecting the nitrogen in the lake? And Doyle Stevens said, oh, it's all the streams. And I said, no, that's probably trivial. You got a big tub out there where all this nitrogen has accumulated. So what's coming in each year is probably a small percentage. The stream flow is going to affect long-term changes, not the short-term changes. And so what I'm modeling here is assuming that it's a short-term process and those inflows are not necessarily negligible for the short term. Yeah. They're going to accumulate in there over the long term.
Gotcha. Okay.
Any other questions? If not, thank you.
Right? Oh, there we go. Good afternoon. I'm Garth Herring, an avian ecologist with the Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center, which is USGS, out of Corvallis, Oregon. And so you might be wondering, why is a guy from Oregon that's really wet talking at a conference about... Closer? There we go. Why is a guy from Oregon that's really wet talking about terminal lakes? And the reality is that Oregon is part of the Great Basin. We have terminal lakes, and we have lots and lots of dry areas. And we have one of the only 3 hypersaline lakes. That would be Lake Abert. So today, with my co-presenters, Christine Rumsey and Scott Hynek from the Utah Water Science Center, we're going to be talking about USGS's current efforts to help understand the long-term decline of terminal lakes across the entire Great Basin. And that's part of USGS's Saline Lake Ecosystems Integrated Water Availability Assessment Project. I'm only going to say that once. Big name, lots of effort. So this project, I just realized I don't have my glasses on. This will help. I won't make up words now. This project was funded in 2022 with an act of Congress. That was the Saline Lake Ecosystems Program Act of 2022. And that was a huge effort to get that funded. Thanks to the efforts of Senator Merkley and Romney, we had bipartisan support, which in my experience in 25 years of being in this country, I'm originally from Canada, seems to be very rare in politics in this country. So that was really exciting to see and great from our perspective as researchers. But it wasn't simply those senators that moved this forward. There were a number of other players. Some of those are in the room today, like National Audubon Society. Marcel Shoup talked to Congress, basically, was asked to come to Congress and helped convince Congress that this was something that was important to do, that we needed to continue to do science at a larger extent than simply smaller studies at some of those small lakes. That's not to say the work done at Great Salt Lake is small. By no means it is not small. The one thing I want to quickly acknowledge is obviously Great Salt Lake within the entire Great Basin is the monster in the room. It's the biggest, it's the baddest, it's got the most birds. And I'm not going to talk about it too much today, but Scott and Christine surely will. So our basic project objectives are really to improve understanding of the impacts of water management or hydrology on migratory water birds. And this was something that was really key when Congress acted on this, is that they basically said that this is all tied to water birds. And that was really key because it wasn't simply a traditional IWA, which is really functioned or really relates to riverine systems and not these lake systems. So this was a new approach for them, and it was partly due to the funding coming from Congress and going directly to USGS, but going to the water mission area. And so they kind of put something that would have been a square peg in a round hole. And so they forced it into an IWA. It's not really a true IWA, but we're not going to worry about that too much. And when we started this project in 2022, one of the questions we had is, what questions should we ask? What science should we do? And probably the best way to get at that is actually look at what's being done. We didn't want to come into this naively and say, we know what the problems are, because we didn't. Obviously, folks like Scott and Christine have been working at GSL for a long time, and we do have a good understanding of what some of those problems are, but at the scale of the entire Great Basin, that wasn't appropriate. So what we did is we did a large literature synthesis and a gap analysis, and then we reached out to stakeholders. That literature synthesis involved almost 800 publications from the Great Basin. These were papers that were highly focused on hydrology, on the ecology of the landscape. And so what we did is we looked at, all right, what do we know, what do we not know? And then we took that to stakeholders. We took that to stakeholders across the landscape, and we asked y'all to tell us what were the priorities and what were the priority waterbird guilds. And from that, we then prioritized specific research questions and waterbird guilds, shorebirds coming out as those that were the most important, and that's pretty clear from the recent presentation by the Audubon just prior to this. So those priority science questions, I'm not going to get into the specifics of those, but they're largely related to water availability, how that relates to waterbird habitat conditions and subsequent use of these lakes, and then subsequently how those two directly impact terminal lake waterbird habitat resiliency, or the ability of these lakes to support waterbirds. And I think one of the strengths of what we were told to do by Congress is the fact that they said, focus on a lot of lakes, not simply one lake. And that means that our goal is really to think about this system as an interconnected system rather than individual lakes that function on their own, because that's actually it's really not true of the way this system functions. So we're using an interdisciplinary approach where we do everything from waterbird movement ecology work to studying prey availability to looking at water quality and water quantities, as well as using remote sensing. And the remote sensing is really the glue that kind of binds these different components together, so we kind of understand what's happening across the entire landscape. And when Congress gave us this project, they basically said, here's a list of 20 lakes. We didn't get enough funding, and I'm not complaining about how much funding we got, just to be clear, but we didn't get enough funding to work on 20 lakes. 20 lakes is a massive list of lakes, so we had to prioritize. And the first way we did that was look at what lakes were the most critical to shorebirds, because that's what our stakeholders told us were critical at the landscape scale. So then once we prioritized those lakes based on shorebird habitats and how populations of shorebirds use those lakes, we then developed a hierarchy from intensive to intermediate to limited sampling. And you can kind of just quickly scan through this, but we do different things at those different levels. But we try to do as much as possible at those intensive lakes. And there's some lakes in there, like Mono Lake, that don't bubble up as being intensive lakes, and that's a function of difficulty getting there, but also it's because there's a lot of science being done at that lake, and so we can do a lot with collaborations at lakes like Mono Lake. So at Mono Lake, we work with John Milak from UC Santa Barbara. He's working with Christine and I to provide us with data and samples, and we're in turn going to give him data back. We also collaborate across the entire landscape with a lot of other stakeholders, NGOs, to maximize the dollars that we've got in this project. So at Great Salt Lake, we personally don't do a lot of sampling, but we rely on GSLEP, thank you GSLEP, for providing data to us and samples that we can then burn up, generate estimates of calories, and send those data back to GSLEP. We also work with graduate students across the landscape. Here at Great Salt Lake, we work with Lauren Head from Utah State University, one of Mike Conover's students. Lauren's been providing us with samples. We're going to return energetic estimates back to Lauren, and then she's going to give us estimates of densities that we can then use in our modeling efforts. So we're really trying to maximize what we're doing across the entire landscape. So at this point in time, we're going to pivot. Scott's going to come up, and he's going to talk about the Great Basin terminal lakes, kind of how they function, and some of the variation in hydrology across those lakes.
Okay, think this, I just perfect the leaning over kind of style. So, or that. The Great Basin, between the Wasatch and the Sierras, right, it's moving apart. There's sort of, Nevada has more mountain ranges than any state in the country, right? And intervening, we have these basins. A lot of them are closed. I talked earlier today about water balance, and, when it's colder and a little bit wetter, you get huge lakes in these places. But one of the key things, and we were talking about this about Great Salt Lake, these systems are transient by nature. Christine keeps talking about dynamism, or everyone kind of notes these types of things. There is no steady state here. They're constantly changing and moving. We're still mining some of the water from these Ice Age lakes. In other instances, like Great Salt Lake, I could hazard a residence time of water in the lake, but it would be on the order of years, right? And so one of the things you could maybe do is dispel the notion that this is like a remnant of the Ice Age lake, right? It's just the newest embodiment of this terminal closed system where everything discharges to the atmosphere. And so then these systems today, as we study them, take on a lot of different scenarios. You'll see here Warner Lake, it's deep, getting shallower, less deep. Lake Abert, Summer Lake in Oregon. These are more sort of natural type systems with, Lake Abert has surface water inflow. Summer Lake's completely groundwater fed. Walker Lake is fed mostly by the Walker River. These are sort of the natural embodiments of the system that support birds. There's also a whole series of these, scenarios where the basin no longer has a lake, right? It had one, now it doesn't. The water still discharges to this hydrologic terminus. It goes there, and it eventually leaves the system to the atmosphere. And the way that a lot of these systems, they're just kind of large, complex wetland, groundwater discharge complexes. But the way they've been sort of turned into over the years, managed for birds, is a series of impoundments, right? So we also do a lot of work in these places, and that's kind of neat because it provides some experimental controls and some constraints that you don't always get in a natural system. So this is, and Garth mentioned remote sensing, and this is one of the things that we can do across the whole Great Basin, stitch all these systems together. Here's some, an example of some previous work. You're just looking at lake area. These are a lot. This isn't our exact subset, but this is a lot of the lakes that are included in our study system. And I just want to pause for a second and point out one of the issues with remotely sensed data, right? I showed earlier today you could time travel with this stuff, right? So we can look at change through time, and Paul Ingebrand said, oh yeah, Landsat's been around since I was a baby. But then I asked myself, well, what's going on with California? If these lakes are in great decline, why do the trends look like this? And the answer is, well, Paul Ingebrand wasn't a baby in 1900. So what you see, if you actually zoom out, and you'll see Mono Lake now here on the top, right? If you just looked at the last 20 or 30 years, it would look like it's on the rebound. But in fact, it's rebounding from a diminished stature. Same thing you'll see here for Walker Lake, Pyramid Lake, okay? And then the other thing I want to point out here is that this is just change in lake level, right? So that's feet, and it's all normalized to a starting point. That was 0, and it's all relative differences. We were looking at mean depths for Great Salt Lake as a function of lake level, and Jake showed that, I think, 10 to 20 feet maybe, right? So Great Salt Lake, the depth is not the full story, right? So if you turn these into volumes, right, which is one of the key tasks here for us in terms of turning water management into ecology, is you need to know how much water, not how deep, unless you're looking at habitat, you need to know how much water. So one of our tasks is to go ahead and turn these lake level records into lake volume records. And again, you see here a pyramid in particular is very interesting. The shape of it changes quite a lot, and you can actually see, well, it looks like it kind of recovered, like something happened in the 60s, probably 50s and 60s, right? There's big tribal water rights associated with this. There were major sort of long-term management decisions that put the floor in this decline. Same thing with Mono Lake, right? Everyone probably knows that story. But, right, by this graph, the historical low was in 1982. That's because of management. One of the questions, and our colleague Ramon works a lot in Walker Lake, is they're starting to acquire water rights there. They're working with tribes and agriculture to try and manage this. Maybe 2017 right now is a historical low. Is that it, right? Have they put the floor in there? Can management turn this? I think is a fair question, and one that we're trying to address. And I'd just like to extend that to Great Salt Lake, which I think of as the Rosetta Stone, right? This is the giant integrator. Okay, we've got a long record, 180 years, huge basin, right? Big lake, kind of a really nice integrated signal. And so, one question I think was 2022 a historical low at Great Salt Lake? Can we put the floor in there? And while Great Salt Lake is the Rosetta Stone in many ways, one of the things I want to do, and we take so much knowledge from this community to these other places, and they're always excited to hear about what we've done or what we know, or all of you. I'm just sharing knowledge. But one of the points I want to make about this whole program before, Garth and Christine get back into how we integrate these water volumes into real ecological benefits is, what can we take from these other lakes? Why would anybody in Great Salt Lake care about this place, other than you care about birds and they share this resource? What other fundamental lessons can we pick up? And Lake Abert happens to be a place that our team has been able to integrate really well for a number of reasons. It's a focus lake because it's shallow. Heavy shorebird use, a lot of migratory birds. It's, there, and Mono Lake and Great Salt Lake are the places with Artemia, the brine shrimp, and the brine flies. So it's become a really nice example of what we can do when we integrate. And I sometimes think of it when I go there, and you'll see a little bit the volumes associated with this lake. And that's why, I say a little bit goes a long ways. A while ago, around 2002 or 22, when Great Salt Lake was kind of hitting these lows, I hearken back to the great financial crisis of 2008, and I kind of hatched this joke, what does Great Salt Lake have in common with Citibank or JP Morgan Chase, right? These kind of things. It's too big to fail, right? And Abert, for me, is this really exciting place because it's small enough to succeed. Just a little bit goes a long ways. So this is a place, the lake completely desiccated at some point, 2017 and thereabouts. We were able to acquire the USGS, not our project, but the USGS, the broader, was able to acquire LIDAR from a dry lake bed, okay? And now we can repurpose that for many, 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 many things, okay? And one of the things I want to highlight is one of the things, and this is a very challenging environment to do this, so it's an important test bed. We're trying to use this dynamic surface water extent data set developed from Landsat to basically turn lake area into elevation and volume. And if we can do that here, one of the most challenging places, we can do that at all of these ungauged lakes where we're not actually measuring height or volume or don't understand it, but we can develop a relationship between area, volume, and water surface elevation. And one of the things you see here you just get a sense for the numbers here. There's about, since we've been on the case here in Abert, and there's a gauge there you can see that measures lake elevation. There's been about 5 feet of lake level variation. a doubling of acreage from between the low and the high. And then you see at the lowest elevation, we're talking 20,000 acre feet, right? And this still supports a lot of birds. And then what I want you to see there in the light blue on the outline, this is all stuff we just do with the LiDAR data, we're able to map the distribution and calculate the area of shorebird habitat based on different depths, okay? So foraging depths, 5, 10, we had been saying 10, and we got some new ecologists on board, and they wanted 12 to be different than 10, to different than 20, and so there are real differences there, but this is a situation where we can actually do that. And then I'll just show you here, this is sort of that, the recent record that's been supported by this project at this lake. So you'll see the lake elevation, okay, in the blue, and I've kind of highlighted there the water volumes that are associated with those. The gauge goes dry at around 20,000 acre feet. The maximum we've seen is 155,000 acre feet. You see the dissolved salt mass there, right? This is, earlier today you heard about 1 billion tons, right? Now we're down at 2 million tons or something, right? So this is a small lake, but it has outsized ecological benefit. And I think those are some of the lessons that maybe we can bring back to Great Salt Lake. One of the things that Garth will talk about, right, and this is often what happens when you look at data that doesn't make sense, right? The lake level gauge, it's really noisy in this place, and it's a shallow and a windy lake. And our colleague Ramon, Garth will show better images, where you see this red triangle up there, had placed a camera. So we have time-lapse imagery. And we watch the north end of this lake, the wind will move the water 4 miles up, okay? And so, that noise in the lake level gauge is actually real. It's not like there's a problem with the elevation. It's just that the lake is highly dynamic. And in fact, it's really interesting because you take a little bit of water and you spread it really thin over a huge area, and it has potentially interesting ecological benefit. And then the other part, so the wind's part of that, a little bit goes a long ways. The other thing to note is that this at the south end here where you see that green circle, that's where the only river in the basin comes into the lake. And it sometimes, that river sometimes flows out of the aptly named River's End Reservoir. And so, my hypothesis when I approached this lake was, okay, this is an end member that's completely dominated by surface water inflow. So that'll be really interesting to compare to Summer Lake across the way, which shares a drainage divide, and there is no surface water inflow. It's just a series of large spring complexes that feed that lake. Okay, what are the response times of these lakes? Their volumes, the ecological benefit, the resilience that we might get from a surface water versus a hypothesized more sluggish groundwater system. So I'm just going to zoom in here really quickly. So there's the reservoir, and you can see the lake, or the river leaving the reservoir and going into the lake. This is the delta. This reservoir, by the way, was constructed sometime in the 90s. And anyway, a lot of people are perplexed by that situation. And then I want to show you here this southwest corner spring. So we've documented a lot of avocet use there. It's just 1.5 CFS, just kind of just popping out of the basalt, running across, and then you see all the green downstream of that. It generates, per unit volume, it generates a lot of habitat and use. And so, a little bit can go a long ways in the right situation, the right circumstance. And of course, this is reliable stuff. That water never stops flowing. And it could be quite old. I just found out a few weeks ago that it's, the radiocarbon content of this is about 50% of modern carbon. So, is tens of thousands of years, maybe, I don't know. So a little bit goes a long ways. And we've always talked about SESH at Great Salt Lake, and we document it with lake level records, but one of the things we started thinking about is, okay, at the south end or Ogden Bay, when lake level's low, can you increase a lot of habitat in ways east to west or ways we haven't thought about? And then the other thing I want to just point out here Colton Williamson is a master's student at Kip Solomon's, and he started working with us on radon, which is a proxy for groundwater discharge and surface water. And based on observations in Farmington Bay and at Lake Abert, we were seeing some of these groundwater discharge areas were receiving a lot of shorebird use. And so we're mapping this out in the Bear River Bird Refuge. Here you can see some sites that have anomalously high radon. And they're actually drying out that side of the refuge so that they can replace water control structures. And, what we see is the water's still flowing, right? There's some groundwater discharging into that unit, which is not a standard unit where you would find shorebirds, right? It's not a shallow, playa-like impoundment. But we identified some likely groundwater input there. And if you look at our Avocet data from Bear River Bay, you'll just see there in the circle. And then you see that the stars are where these avocets were captured. These are GPS backpacks on these birds. This is where they're going, right? And, you could kind of see they're going where the water's shallow and muddy, where bugs are probably easy to eat. But mysteriously, they're also showing up in the sort of more typical deltaic impoundment on the Bear River, which it really isn't managed for shorebirds. And so, one of the questions is, maybe there's just a little bit of groundwater in that spot is providing something they need. One of the things I've learned from Garth and his colleagues is that when avocets have young, they actually need fresh water. So, there's all kinds of things going on. But that's just the point, again, that a little bit goes a long ways, and it sort of depends on when, where, why, how is this water put to use. And then Christina Garth can tell you a lot more, rather than just volumes, about the mechanistics of how water quality and ecology sort of drive this. And then this is just, I think, an area normalized kind of scrambled artistic rendition of all of our study lakes, okay? And one of the things that we want to do is remake that map where those are all volumes and see how it changes. And the deep lakes, of course, are gonna grow in stature, and Great Salt Lake might diminish a bit if it, not quite sure. But that's one of our goals, is to turn volumes of water into ecology. And then, of course, I think the final thing, the lesson that Great Salt Lake can take from these other lakes is, well, it appears we've put the bottom in some of these lakes. They're not declining anymore. And people yesterday, said, well, yeah, it just takes time, right? So, there's a chance that we've hit the historic low, but it's not like it's going to bounce back to 1980s level anytime soon. So I think you can put the bottom in a lake, but you won't know you did it until a long ways down the road.
Hi, everybody. Christine again, and excited to share work on these terminal lake ecosystems. So Scott just kind of walked us through water volume, the importance of water availability, and now I'm going to take us into kind of a different realm, which is considering not only how much water is there, the importance of water presence or absence, but what type of water is there, what's the salinity, and how does that affect the ecosystem. So given the nature of these lakes and the fact that they're closed basins, they're endorheic, they accumulate solutes that are transported through the basin. So you have rivers and groundwater traveling through these watersheds and ending in a terminal basin. And because of that, they're picking up a lot of solutes. And so there's this potential to accumulate solutes over time, over hundreds to thousands of years. That's different from a freshwater lake where you can kind of flush solutes out. So a key component of our work is to try and understand what is the salinity of these lakes, what's the water chemistry of them. That tells us about what kind of ecosystem might exist. It gives us some indication about how close these ecosystems might be to tipping points. And I'm showing in this graphic from Bonnie's work on the food chain of Great Salt Lake. We tend to see in less saline waters greater biodiversity, so a greater number of species can exist in fresher ecosystems. And then we see, for example, as we increase salinity, for example, to the south arm salinity of around 12%, as shown in Bonnie's graphic. We then kind of narrow the species pool down to 2 major macroinvertebrates. And so so with increases in salinity, you tend to see a contraction in the diversity or number of species. But along with that, as Phil mentioned, they have these extremophiles have really interesting metabolic methods or pathways that allow them to survive in these hypersaline environments. That gives them an advantage. And so while we tend to see fewer species, we see a lot of them, really a highly abundant, very productive ecosystems at this hypersaline range. So our work throughout the Great Basin is trying to say, well, what are the salinity ranges that exist in these terminal basins, and how might they affect the macroinvertebrate community, which is what Garth is really digging into. And in addition to that, salinity and water chemistry tell us a lot about the hydrology, just the basics of how water gets to the lake, how these solutes are cycling. So they're really important tools for fundamentally understanding the ecology and hydrology of these lakes. So where we've been working, my team and I, is across the Great Basin, including areas in Utah, Nevada, and Oregon. Less in California because we have partnerships at Mono. But this map kind of breaks down what the salinity is for each of these key lakes we've been studying. The first thing, and the different colors represent the different salinity sort of categories that exist. So our three hypersaline lakes in the system, you can see are shown in red. We've got the south arm of Great Salt Lake, Mono Lake, and Lake Abert. We also have a whole collection of freshwater terminal lakes kind of in southern Oregon and California. So think Malheur, Warner, Goose Lakes, as well as Ruby Lake, which drains the Ruby Mountains in Nevada. And then there's also a collection of these lakes where there's a distribution of different salinities, where we might have both fresh and kind of saline as well as hypersaline. So I'm going to dig into those a little bit because they build on what Scott was talking about, how there can be a number of different habitat types at these terminal lake ecosystems. So zooming in on Great Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake wetlands, we see a lot of fresh water in those aquatic habitats, and we also see a lot of kind of more saline and hypersaline ecosystems. And this map is showing work that we did in partnership with Lauren Head and her bioenergetics study at Great Salt Lake, which, by the way, they're doing amazing work. And so we kind of partnered with them to just say, well, we just want to measure kind of basic water quality parameters that we can share with you, as well as water chemistry. And so across sites like Farmington Bay, Willard Spur, and a couple of different impoundments in Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, we're seeing a range in salinity just within these systems. So fresher water near the Jordan River outflow at the south end of Farmington Bay, some impoundments in Bear River that are quite saline. And so not only do we have this big range across the region, but as you zoom into an individual study area, there's a lot of diversity in aquatic habitat as it relates to salinity. Considering another lake in Nevada, this is Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge, which is the terminus of the Carson River, which drains the Sierra Nevada in California. And I know this is a little bit hard to see, but basically what we see throughout Stillwater is a series of impoundments like we see at the waterfowl management areas here. And that impoundments near the freshwater inflow, we see fresher conditions, and then as the water moves through these impoundments, the chemistry changes as well as the salinity changes, so that by the time we get to the terminus of the system, we're in a saline and sometimes in a hypersaline ecosystem. So within 80,000 acres of surface area, you can have a wide range in salinity conditions that can support a whole bunch of different types of aquatic invertebrates. And then lastly, I'll share an example from southern Oregon. So this is Summer Lake and Lake Abert, shown here. And then again, these colors just sort of distinguish between fresher stuff. The fresher stuff is shown in yellow, and then more hypersaline stuff shown in red. And I love this system so much because these lakes are the kind of, not the remnant, maybe a descendant of Lake Shuakan, the Pleistocene Ice Age lake. And so at one point in time, they were connected. They were a large lake. And today, they've become two distinct lakes fed by two different water sources. Summer Lake, as Scott mentioned, is fed by a groundwater source. Lake Abert fed by surface water at the south end. And the salinities are very different. So Summer Lake has more of a salinity around, I just measured around 5 grams per liter, whereas Lake Abert can be much higher, 100, 150 grams per liter. So even though they have kind of this geologic shared history, they are very different in the modern day. And one hypothesis for why this is that Summer Lake is a really flat playa lake, very, very shallow, and it often goes dry. So during certain periods of the year, it's very, very dry. You have a lot of exposed playa. And every afternoon we drive by there when we're doing field surveys, it's windy. and you can see huge dust plumes just kind of just blowing off the playa. And so hypothesis that was generated in the 70s is that you're actually, when those lakes go dry, you're actually blowing a lot of the salt away, which keeps it as a fresher ecosystem when it becomes rehydrated and becomes saturated again. So by being able to see this diversity of salinity across the region, we know that there's a diversity of aquatic habitat. We think about salt cycling processes differently, as all these different lakes are have a different dominant mechanism at play. But salinity is not all created equal. So it's not just about the amount of dissolved solids, kind of a generic measurement. It's also about the types of ions that exist to create a given salinity. And I know this plot can be pretty overwhelming. Scott hates it, but I insist on using it. And it's basically a way to interpret major ion chemistry and just say, well, what types of water exist in our system? And so I want to focus on the middle kind of diamond diagram. And I've broken all of our samples. So as we've gone and done all this sampling across the basin, we've been collecting water samples for analysis. And so I've binned these samples by state. So Utah shown in red, Nevada in kind of an orangey color, and Oregon in light blue, and California in dark blue. And what's really even fun about this is to see that there are these regional patterns, regional evolution in water chemistry across the space. So for for Utah, which includes Great Salt Lake, Sevier, Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge in the West Desert, the dominant type of water, the dominant ions creating salinity and in our state is there's sodium and chloride, so sodium chloride water. As we move further west, especially like at Stillwater, we see kind of a shifting and a higher component of carbonates in the water. Ruby Lake, which drains the Ruby Mountains in Nevada, is kind of in this magnesium bicarbonate system, which is like really unique and distinct. And then the further west we go, especially into our Oregon lakes, the water is really made up of sodium bicarbonate predominantly. So we can just see across the entire region, the ions that are creating salinity change. And that has implications potentially for the macroinvertebrate communities as these different ratios change. Additionally, within a given study area, changes in water chemistry can tell us about water sources. So is a system surface water dominated or is it groundwater dominated? And that gives us some indication of the sustainability or resilience of a system if we kind of know how the water is getting there. Okay, so I've kind of walked you through these big, broad changes through space, through a region within these different study areas. As I kind of dove into this morning, it's also really important to consider how salinity is changing through time. Again, because of the terminal nature of these lakes and how they respond to hydrology and evaporative processes, salinity changes, and it changes at different magnitudes in different places. And so here is just an example showing 3 of our study areas, and I chose the hypersaline lakes. The plot shows salinity in grams per liter from October of 2023 to present, so about 2.5 years of data. We've got Great Salt Lake in red, Lake Abert in green, and Mono Lake in blue. And I love this plot because we can just put our own Great Salt Lake system into a broader context of what these other hypersaline lakes are experiencing. For example, Mono Lake is just so surprisingly steady. I mean, the salinity in that system doesn't seem to have a ton of seasonal variation, at least relative to Great Salt Lake. And it's really kind of holds steady around 80 grams per liter. And so why is that? Because here at Great Salt Lake, I always think, the snowmelt runs off, we get this huge pulse of water, and you would expect the salinity to change, which it does, and we observe. But there, it's like, is it a groundwater flow path that's sort of this slow release of water, and you get this overlapping with evaporative rates? There's all kinds of hypotheses for why it is so steady. And then Abert, one of my favorite places in the world now, is super dynamic. So you can, in one season, we got a change in salinity of like 100 grams per liter. And so when I see that, so you get to see this huge spike in 2024 at Abert, I'm like, okay, if I'm a brine shrimp or a brine fly or alkali fly, what is it like to undergo that rate of increase in salinity? And so that's what's going to be really exciting about working with Garth, to see how his macroinvertebrate samples change during that huge salinity change. And these simple measurements of salinity can tell us also about seasonal variability. In Abert, we see not only temporal variability through the season, but in the spring in particular, you see a lot of spatial variability. So a lot of fresh water at the south end, a lot of more hypersaline water at the north end. So there's just a lot of dynamism happening at a place like Lake Abert. And then again, addressing the question, is salinity all that matters to aquatic organisms? So here's an example from Lake Abert in Oregon, just showing kind of a general trend in salinity through time, but then also breaking down the major ion composition through time. And at Lake Abert, the salinity is really, when you talk about changes in salinity, we're talking about changes in sodium, in carbonate, and in chloride. And so hopefully we're hoping to pair our data with Garth's to say, what are the organisms responding to in these waters when the environmental conditions change like this? And is it important or is it not important? And so with that, I'll kick it off to Garth, who's going to go into a little bit more of how prey availability responds to environmental conditions and how that might relate to bird movement changes that we observe. So thanks.
All right, I'm back. You've got me till the end of this talk, so let's get this done. So one of the reasons why this overall project was funded and Congress acknowledged the importance of this is because of water birds. And so integral to this overall project is understanding how water birds respond to change across the landscape. So one of the pillars of science is specifically looking at water bird movement. So this is work that Josh Ackerman and Alex Hartman out of the Western Ecological Research Science Center in Dixon, California are doing. And I'm just going to use a couple of their results slides to kind of illustrate how that information that they're gathering on water bird movement is really useful. And so the first way we can use their data to try and understand what birds are doing on the landscape is look at large-scale migration patterns. And these are largely data for American avocets in red. There's a little bit of data for Wilson's phalaropes. We've had difficulties with phalaropes because they're so small, it's difficult to get a GPS package that goes on those birds. These are experimental size transmitters, and they don't last very well. So the data there are very limited. And I think they only deployed about 6 or 8 of those transmitters, and maybe 3 or 4 of them gave reasonable data for a couple of days. So if we just focus on the avocet data, there's a couple of key things to see with these data. The first is birds coming out of Great Salt Lake do their own thing, which is go south, don't stop anywhere until you get to Mexico. They're obviously stopping in a few places along the way, but they're making big movements. And then they're trucking on down to that coast of the mainland on Mexico. Birds coming out of the west side of the Great Basin do a very different thing. They're stopping at a lot of these terminal lakes. There's more terminal lakes, more smaller terminal lakes on the west side of the Great Basin. So they're using those as they move further south. And then they do one of two things. They either jump off and they head to San Francisco Bay where they overwinter in the salt ponds, or they continue south and mix with those birds coming in from Great Salt Lake and head on down to Mexico, which sounds like a pretty good place to spend winter. So that's one way we can use those data. The other way is we can actually look at movements within the Great Basin itself. And so this is thinking about how birds use multiple lakes. Again, birds from Great Salt Lake Lake being the big sweaty monster in the room, is huge. So those birds are sticking to the lake pretty tightly. But the birds on the western portion of the basin are moving around. This is after they've finished nesting, that is, or if they've failed nesting. They tend to bump around on the landscape a bit. And they are definitely using a lot of those lakes as they move south, either to Mexico or to San Francisco Bay. And then the third way we can use these data is to think about movements within lakes. So this is sort of focal scale efforts to understand water bird ecology. And today we're just going to look at a couple of quick examples from Lake Abert. We're not playing favorites here. It's just a nice way to tell a story. And it's a relatively simple lake to talk about compared to Great Salt Lake. So Lake Abert, we can look at 2023, which was a pretty dry year. So a lot of bird use on that northern end of the lake and the west side of the lake. And then on the east side of the lake, where it's a little bit deeper, it's very narrow, that band of habitat they're using. We can contrast that with 2024, different year hydrologically, quite concentrated efforts sort of in that central region of the lake, and they start to extend out to the middle of the lake. The reason why we don't see that in the year prior is the middle of that lake is fairly deep, and when we say deep at Abert, that means that it's more than a meter deep. That's pretty shallow, I recognize, but it does make for interesting ecology. So then we can look at 2025, the year that just wrapped up. A pretty wet year. We had a lot of water in the lake. Again, relative, slightly less than 2 meters total depth in the lake, and those birds use that northern part of the lake very heavily. So that's just a kind of a quick and dirty way to look at how these birds are using these landscapes. And we're going to come back to this idea of these birds using the northern part of that lake when we talk about some of the hydrology work that Scott alluded to earlier with the sesh effects that we see at the lake. And so this gets to some work being done by Ramon Naranjo out of the Nevada Water Science Center, who's been focusing on thinking about how much water do these birds actually need. And at Lake Abert, this is kind of interesting if we come back to this idea of birds using the northern portion of that lake a lot and what that means. Well, the simple answer to this is that that northern part of the lake is really, really important for these birds. And so this is what the northern part of the lake looks like. It doesn't appear to be very large. Again, remember, Great Salt Lake is huge. Everything else is small. I get it. But what we're actually looking at here, this is 7 kilometers across that lake. So it's not small, but it is relative to GSL. And this is a day in October. Note that it's still a little toasty out there. It's 98 degrees still. And 24 hours later, this is what that habitat looks like. So we've had a wind come up, and we've had a large sesh effect, and pushed a lot of water up into the northern part of this lake. And Ramon's modeling work suggests that they've, on big wind effect days, at low stage levels, you're actually increasing the overall lake size by about 8%. And 8% isn't a huge amount, but relative to the total lake size, that's a fair amount of habitat to create in 24 hours. Now, if we think about shorebirds, excluding phalaropes, they need to be in relatively shallow water. So they're not out in the middle of that lake. So if we constrict that percentage of how much habitat we're creating when you flood the northern part of that lake, it's probably closer to 15 to 20% new habitat being created. You're actually not losing habitat on the southern part of the lake. Most of that water is kind of coming from the middle portion of the lake. So that's a huge amount of habitat to create in 24 hours. And what happens, we saw this recently, we hovercrafted out there, and the brine shrimp are obviously moving into this area with the water, so you're creating new habitat. It's very shallow, and it's full of brine shrimp, and those brine shrimp got nowhere to go, and then the water levels recede, and it concentrates the brine shrimp across this very flat, shallow pan. The other thing that's happening, which is pretty interesting, Christine almost lost her mind, is that there's a ton of salt sitting on that pan. So when you move the water into that area, you actually increase the salt concentration, and it doubled in 24 hours. So it went from, I don't do salt concentrations, I do conductivity. So in my mind, it went from 55,000 to about 110,000 in 24 hours. That's, I don't know what that is percentage-wise, Christine? A lot. That's a lot. So what we don't know is later in the season when the salt concentration increases in the lake proper and these events continue to happen, will you see that same bump, or is that salt not drying out on that salt pan? Is it going into the main part of the lake, or is there enough salt up on that pan to continue to do this? And is there a threshold at which point that concentration won't continue to increase that much? But there is possibility that if it does continue to increase like that, at some point in time, it might get to the point where you start to eclipse some of those lower thresholds where brine shrimp are going to be happy. And that might be interesting from the perspective of if you're a shorebird and you've got brine shrimp that suddenly are getting impacted by getting dumped into a super salty situation super fast, it might make them easier to be depredated, that is, fed upon. Okay, so we've been talking about all the different components of this project. We haven't really talked about how we integrate across those different science disciplines, and that was our #1 task. We spent way too much time talking about this in the early days of this project, about how to integrate across these different pillars. So now I want to try and pull from these different pillars and talk about how we bring some of that science together to do some modeling work to think about how well these lakes support shorebirds. And so we're going to talk about energetics modeling. And critical to that is an understanding of how variable the energetic density of the invertebrates is across the landscape. So caveat here, we're not talking about hypersaline lakes. We're still doing the work in the lab for the energetics on those. Turns out when you take brine shrimp from a hypersaline lake, there's a ton of salt on them. It makes it a really big pain in the butt to do the energetics work. You got to get rid of that salt, and you got to do it in a way that's consistent across 3 different lakes. So these are from what we are calling our freshwater lakes. They're not clearly freshwater. They're from freshwater to mesosaline. But there's a lot of variability in the energetics. So that tells us that some lakes, at least from an energetic standpoint, at the meter square level, might be better than other lakes. However, they could have more habitat and balance that out. We haven't got to that point to think about how much habitat there is yet. This is simply analyzing the data, looking at how much energy there is on a small scale. The other thing that's interesting to think about is that that energy varies across time. And so this is across all of our data when we account for the different lakes. And you see early in the season, densities of energy are relatively low and they jump up really quick early in the spring. And this is probably a function of water temperature, and then they start to decline. That decline could be related to increasing salinity. It could be related to increasing water temperatures, which has an effect on freshwater invertebrates in their growth rates and mass. And then it declines off pretty precipitously toward the end of the season. And that could be a function of shorebird depredation at some of these lakes. So where you are matters, and how much energy is pretty variable. So if we want to take these energy estimates and take them and use them in a meaningful way, we need to know how much energy a shorebird actually needs. So we're going to rely on our American avocet. Everybody loves avocets. They're really common in the system. We got great data on the transmitter birds, and we know from energetic modeling that they need between 520 and roughly 760 kilojoules of energy in a day. Those differences in how much energy they need is dependent on what they're doing. If you're just doing maintenance, that is just trying to get through the day, you don't need as much energy. But if you're preparing to migrate, you need a lot more energy. And so they're trying to accumulate a lot more lipids before they fly somewhere. Avocets aren't a really long distance migrant for shorebirds. Probably maximum they're flying maybe 1,000, 1,500 miles, something like that. And it depends where they are in the landscape. It differs, obviously. If you think about those birds coming out of Great Salt Lake, they're moving long distances further. But we're going to use these estimates today to kind of walk through some scenarios. We know from our energetics work how much energy there is at the meter square level across these lakes. And so they need somewhere between 13 and roughly 20 meters of habitat in a given day. And we can take that a step further and say that that's somewhere between 6,000 and roughly 9,000 invertebrates every day. That might seem like an incredibly large number of bugs to eat. And it is, but it's not unrealistic. This is totally within the realm of observational studies where they've looked at foraging shorebirds, avocets in particular, in Europe. And the other thing that's interesting to think to help understand why these numbers are very realistic is that avocets are tactile foragers. They don't actually have to see what they're feeding on. So they're just scything through the water, and as soon as they detect a prey item, they snap shut on that. They have very fast bill reflexes. So that allows them to collect invertebrates out of the water column or out of the sediment. So they can feed 24 hours a day. They're not going to feed 24 hours a day. They take some breaks, but they can feed in the day or at the nighttime. So these numbers really actually make sense. Now at this stage, all we've done is determine how much energy a shorebird needs. The next thing we want to do is think about how useful are these lakes at producing habitat for them, and how much energy is in those lakes, and how can those lakes support these shorebirds? That is, how many shorebirds can they support and for how long? So we're going to talk about carrying capacity, and we're going to use Carson Lake as an example here. Carson Lake is in the Lahontan Valley of Nevada. It's close to Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge and the Carson Sink. We're going to zoom in a little bit. This is what it looks like if we use DSWE, which is one of the tools that John Jones, one of our collaborators in this project, has developed, which is the dynamic surface water extent model. And this basically tells you at specific times of the year the spatial extent of water and the certainty around that at a given site. You can use this model. You can go to this model. It's available right now. There's more data being dumped into it from this project and other areas as well. So we can take this and then we can overlay the bathymetry data that Scott's been working up, and we can actually calculate how much habitat is available at a given point in time for a certain leg length of a shorebird, and then we can take our energetics estimates and determine exactly how much area there is, or how much energy there is in that area. And remember, these birds coming out of Carson Lake are largely moving straight south. They do make some stops at the Owens Valley, but then they're moving on down to Mexico. So in our modeling efforts here, we're assuming they're moving about 1,000 miles. These are not real data, just to be clear. We haven't got to the stage of modeling yet, so we just mocked up how much habitat is available under this scenario. So basically what we said is for Carson Lake, how much habitat is there between 0 and 20 centimeters? And we drew this polygon, which gives you an estimate of about 11 kilometers of habitat. And we then can apply our energetic estimates, and we get a total amount of energy available. And there's obviously some big assumptions here. And we know how many shorebirds use this area. So Stan Center with Audubon Society did a lot of shorebird surveys in this area back in the day. And their peak estimate of American avocet use of this area was about 45,000 birds. So we can take that and apply that to our model, and it tells us that that habitat could support these birds for about 37 days. There's a couple of huge caveats. The first is that avocets are going to compete with each other for food, and they're also going to compete with other shorebirds. And the third thing, which is probably the most important, is that this lake's going to dry across time, right? That's the only one thing that's certain at all these lakes. If you wait for 37 days, that lake's going to recede. But we don't know at this point in time, but that spatial extent and bathymetry data will give us a better understanding of, as it dries, are you actually creating more habitat, or are you losing habitat? So I think that's one of the utilities of integrating across these different pieces of science that we've been collecting, is it really truly helps define how much habitat is available for these different shorebirds. And we can refine that to specific shorebird needs. All right, so I'm to my last slide, so we're in good shape. So today we talked about water inundation. My background is working in the Everglades, so I think about water a little differently than Scott does. Scott loves water volumes. I think about water from the perspective of how deep it is relative to the leg length of a wading bird or a shorebird, but that's just the way I think about it. So water inundation. So put water in the landscape, what does it mean for birds? Christine talks about water chemistry and how critical that is and how it changes across the landscape and the impacts that might have potentially on invertebrate communities. It does have the potential to do that if you get close to those thresholds, and there's some evidence, limited at this point in time with small data sets, that it could be actually impacting the energetics at some of these lakes. We've also looked at prey energetics and how variable they are across time and space, which is really important. And then we looked at waterbird movements. And there's a couple of things here that are interconnected. Well, all of these things ultimately. The first is that we know water inundation, the amount of water, the volume, can impact the water chemistry. Water inundation can also impact energetics. You can concentrate prey, you can make them less concentrated, you can move them around in the landscape like at Lake Ebert. Water chemistry can also influence bird movements on the landscape. And that water chemistry can also change potentially the energetics if you get to those thresholds that we know are out there for these species. And subsequently, changes to prey energetics and water inundation can also influence waterbird movements. And that's important to understand, but the other thing that's important to understand is that this is all happening on very short time frames. The birds make decisions every day and where they're going to forage, and that's a function of water. It's a function of water chemistry and prey energetics. And this could be changing at daily time steps, it could be changing over the season, and it could differ across the entire landscape. So I think that's one of the reasons why we think it's really important to function on a wide range of these lakes across the entire landscape rather than just focusing at a couple of the hypersaline lakes, because it adds value to what we understand. And so we hope a lot of that information is going to be useful from the perspective of what's happening at GSL and vice versa. Obviously, y'all have been doing tons of work for a long time, and I think there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that we can pull from Great Salt Lake and apply to some of these other systems that are also in decline. So with that, I want to thank everybody for actually listening and staying awake. That's great. And I think I've got a few minutes for questions. Yes, great. And by the way, don't buy a hovercraft. Worst piece of research equipment in the world. And I got one for sale. Oh, we got one taker.
This is probably, hello? Probably for Scott and Christine, are any of the lakes in Nevada and Oregon related to like historic sort of calderas that kind of trap terminal lakes in calderas? Like I'm thinking like Thacker Pass, like the lithium deposit.
Okay. Okay.
What I'm asking is, are the lakes, or some of the lakes in Oregon and Nevada, kind of like stranded lakes in historic calderas?
No. And in fact, what you see in Oregon is they're huge, thick, kilometer-and-a-half piles of basalts, and then they're faulted. So they're these kind of half-graben things, and the lake is sitting right next to a huge fault scarp. And just for your reference, Joe, Lake Abert is, you know, a little bit less salinity than the South Arm, and we're talking 10 ppb of lithium or less. So, and very high silica, very high boron, right? Really interesting chemistry, but absolutely no lithium, just sitting in these basalts, you know. And yeah, none of them are calderas. The other ones, like in Nevada, often it just runs out into an old lake basin. It's just kind of really quite boring. A lot of carbonates are really important. They transmit a bunch of the water. But yeah, nothing sitting in a caldera.
Great. Thank you all. This has been really exciting to learn about, and I'm super interested and excited about the possible synergies between your project and like the kind of data that Audubon and Sageland are collecting. And I know you have another month left, another field season left, and you haven't gotten into all your analyses yet. So, Garth, I'm sorry if this is too in the weeds for you. But so Em of Sageland briefly mentioned that Wilson's phalarope may be moving around the lake a little bit more than some of these other shorebirds. And I've kind of been thinking about that in terms of like foraging optimization and where the microbialites are and the water depth and all that kind of stuff. But now I'm starting to wonder, have you seen any patterns in phenology of brine fly in particular? If there's any kind of maturation or emergence phenology that these birds might be tracking?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I meant to allude to the fact that, you know, the data that are coming out now from what Audubon and others have been doing across the Great Basin is super useful to us, right? Because it gives us sort of an N number for how many maximum birds we might expect at these lakes, right? And that's really useful when we want to model carrying capacity and then think about how many birds are there. The key thing to think about with that is that you think about 2022, and this is why these other lakes is important. We almost lost Great Salt Lake, the main part of the lake, right? The freshwater marshes would have been fine. How long it would have been down for, hard to say. But those other lakes would have still existed on the landscape, right? And they wouldn't have absorbed all those birds in that point in time. But they inevitably, in subsequent years, might have picked up some of those birds. So that's really what we want to think about, is how they could support that. Phalaropes, yeah, we're just getting through the data. This is, I don't know if you've heard, but the last year and a half has been a little challenging for us in the federal system. And we've been a little low-staffed, so we've been a little bit behind in the lab. I can't quite put my finger on what's causing that. But anyways, so we're a little bit behind. We just got through the 2024 data. We're almost through 2025. So I can't really say much about the brine shrimp and the brine fly. Those are the hardest samples for us to deal with. I do want to say to GSLEP and everybody that works here that Great Salt Lake is great. No pun intended. Maybe it was. But your samples are the easiest to pick because the water is really clear, relatively speaking. Abert is the biggest pain. It's just full of algae, like literally 90% algae, and it's just bonkers hard to deal with. Mono Lake is also the same. Samples are beautiful. It's great. So I don't have a good answer on what you're asking, but stay tuned.
Yeah, thanks. I forgot to mention, by the way, I'm Mike Ellis, Fish and Wildlife. So
yep.
We've been on a call or two.
I think so recently, yes.
Yeah, we're going to have to talk
yep.
a little bit more. So cool. Thank you, Garth.
Yep. Thanks. We've definitely used our time. I talk too much. Thank you.
It's 3 o'clock, which is usually kind of the nap hour. So Make sure to wiggle your toes, drink some water, coffee, whatever you want, stretch your arms. It's been a long and exciting forum so far. I call the Great Salt Lake Issues Forum the Super Bowl because we bring together so many incredibly passionate, smart, and inspiring minds all in one group. Every 2 years, it feels like a huge celebration, something that one can equate to the Super Bowl. So thank you again to Friends of Great Salt Lake for making it happen every 2 years. This is always so exciting. So as a participant in the forum since 2022, I've heard so much amazing research, planning, management. I'm really excited to maybe tell you guys about something that you probably don't know about yet. And hopefully I'll convince you that the Great Salt Lake Sentinel landscape is not just a new kid on the block. We're actually a critical framework to support all of you and the work that you're already doing. And so with that, Lily and I are going to tell you a little bit more about the Sentinel landscape and how we've been building the structure of our partnership. What? Sure. Yeah. All right, so let's first start with the basics. What is a Sentinel landscape? So in the early 20th century, military installations were constructed in pretty remote areas. And that was intentional because, as you might imagine, the military needs a lot of space to fly their jets, decommission bombs, etc. And over time, as human population has grown, density has also spread, and it's crept closer and closer to installations. And so with that encroachment, other environmental factors have become a concern to the military as well, such as water scarcity, wildlife migration. All of these things can impact the installation. So at the turn of the century, the military decided that instead of constructing new military installations, they're going to protect the ones that we have. And so that begs the question, what does it mean to protect a military installation? So first and foremost, protecting land right outside the fence line of an installation is of first and most importance. And it was realized that by protecting that land right outside the fence line, it interested partners from Fish and Wildlife Service because that's critical wildlife habitat, and also partners from NRCS because oftentimes it's agricultural land and preserving farmers' livelihoods is also important. And then additionally, beyond that 5,000-foot buffer, you can kind of zoom out to a whole geographical area, and the health of that entire geographical area can also impact a military installation. So in all of those realizations, the Department of War, which is what I call it now, they realized that partnerships outside the fence line are critical. They can't do this alone. And so to make this official, Department of War signed an MOU in 2013 with the Department of Agriculture and Department of Interior to form this Sentinel Landscapes Partnership. So all Sentinel landscapes are anchored by one or multiple military installation. They're areas where conservation values and working lands intersect with military installation readiness, whether it's open space protection or habitat connectivity or water conservation. Importantly, you should know all Sentinel landscapes are non-regulatory. So we are not decision makers, but we do work with a lot of partners that are. We are all locally led, we're all locally driven, we exist at local scales, and we're all tailored to each state's unique concerns. So think of Sentinel landscapes each as snowflakes. We're all different. And so here's a map. There's currently 19 Sentinel landscapes scattered around the country, everywhere from Guam to Georgia. And new Sentinel landscapes are born every 2 years. So Great Salt Lake Sentinel Landscape was born in 2024, and this year, in a couple of months, we're gonna get a new cohort of landscapes, which is very exciting. The biggest takeaway from this map is that there's a vast network of partners across the entire country doing very similar work to us. And so this opens up a lot of doors to collaboration, funding, and resources for us here in Utah. So it's important to note the federal and state timeline, kind of how we started and how this all came to be. In 2002, like I said, at the turn of the century, when urban encroachment was becoming a bigger problem for the military, the Congress authorized the Department of War to enter into agreements with partners outside their fence lines to help mitigate this problem. And then in 2013, as I mentioned, that magical MOU was signed when the Sentinel Landscapes Partnership was born. In 2018, the National Defense Authorization Act introduced language that formally recognized the Sentinel Landscapes Partnership in statute. And then importantly, in 2023, our legislature here in Utah passed HCR 7, which supported the creation of the Great Salt Lake Sentinel landscape. And so what is the Great Salt Lake Sentinel landscape? So again, we were born in 2024. Our boundary captures 2.77 million acres across 9 counties. We have 4 military installations within our boundary. And like I said, you just need to have 1 to qualify. But we're lucky enough to have Hill Air Force Base, Camp Williams, Tooele Army Depot, and the Little Mountain Test Facility. And as of today, we have over 50 partners from federal, state, local, and private agencies and organizations that have signed on to work together towards our shared goals. And so you can sort of see on the map, the south arm of Great Salt Lake is our namesake. It's a huge chunk of our landscape and the work that we do as a partnership. And you'll also notice that the north arm is not included, and I promise that was just an acreage problem. So we care about Great Salt Lake as a whole. And importantly, before I get into the org chart, I wanted you all to know that all of these partners are people sitting in this room. They're people that you are familiar with, people that you work with. I want to emphasize again, non-regulatory, locally led. This is a Utah-based partnership. And so the way that our 50 partners are organized from these 50 plus entities, this is our org chart. Don't try to read it. There's a lot of text on here. Maybe just look at the colors. At the very top, you have in orange our executive committee, and these are cabinet level leaders from the Department of War, Department of Interior, Agriculture, and the state of Utah. And primarily they're focused on defining the strategy and vision of the partnership. And their connections to federal and state leadership are also critical for our communications. And then in the green box, you'll see the steering committee. We call those the movers and the shakers of the partnership. This group is comprised of the same state and federal representatives, and they primarily focus on the operations of the partnership. And then last, you'll see the meat and potatoes in blue, the working groups of the partnership. So land conservation, wildlife stewardship, communications, and water resources. This is how we organize these 50 plus agencies and organizations so that we can work together effectively towards our shared goals. So what are our goals? And so first and foremost, the Sentinel landscape is centered around military readiness and resilience. And that's the case with every Sentinel landscape, all 19 of us. But what you see in those other 3 boxes will be entirely different from state to state. Again, we're like snowflakes. But it's nice because all of us Sentinel landscapes in the West, we can commiserate over shared issues like water and fire. And for you all to know, these goals were developed through our designation proposal process, which involved many of you in this room forming these goals. So when we're looking at military installation and community resilience, we're looking at mitigating impacts from incompatible development and doing so in a way that will reinforce agriculture, habitat, and recreation. Next, our partnership works together to mitigate the devastating effects of catastrophic wildfire through fuels management and strategic agency collaboration. And then, of course, at the top of everyone's mind in this room is Great Salt Lake. Our next goal is to bolster installation and community resilience through projects that protect water resources and the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. And lastly, we aim to protect crucial habitat for wildlife, which of course includes migratory birds. Even though that's a picture of a mule deer, I promise birds are important to us. So those goals are massive and they aren't achieved in singularity. So the strategic roadmap that we'll be using to guide our success in this partnership is this Great Salt Lake Sentinel Landscape Implementation Plan. And again, this is something that all Sentinel landscapes have in common. We all have implementation plans. It's a guide for our partnerships to be able to collaborate effectively, help us identify areas of overlap, such as what are Sentinel landscape projects and what are not Sentinel landscape projects. It's a way for us to communicate effectively at local, state, and federal levels. Additionally, it's a way for us to bring in resources and then to track our collective impact over time. So again, don't try to read the words on this diagram. I know they're pretty tiny, but this pyramid represents the general framework of our plan. So at the very top, you'll see vision, purpose, principles. The darker tiers are our goals, actions, and strategies. The actions we take at the bottom are going to yield successful strategies yield successful goals, and you can see how it works going up the pyramid. But the implementation plan is intended to be dynamic, just as our partnership is, and adaptive. So, we're moving up the pyramid and down the pyramid at the same time as priorities change over time. And you'll hear me say this a lot. The Sentinel landscape and this plan are intended to be creative and flexible and adaptable. We work across jurisdictions to fill in critical gaps together. And so with that, Lily's going to tell you a little bit more about how we've been building our plan.
Thanks, Marisa. My name is Lily Wetterlin, and I work with SWCA Environmental Consultants, and we've had the privilege to work with the Sentinel landscape on developing this implementation plan. And we were kind of contracted to, help with facilitation, working with all the partners that Marisa mentioned earlier, and then also actually drafting the plan. So to start, I want to kind of briefly walk through how we developed this implementation plan. And from the beginning, which I feel like Marisa has iterated numerous times, it was designed to be very and highly collaborative. And that really reflects the cross-boundary nature of the partnership and its focus on both natural resource conservation and national defense resilience. The first step was setting up the partnership structure, including the steering committee, executive committee, and those working groups that Marisa mentioned earlier. And each of those working groups were meant to align with each of the plan's goals. So from there, partners worked together to define the vision and purpose of the Sentinel landscape. The goal was to bring together military installations and regional partners to support military readiness while also conserving land, water, wildlife habitat, and the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. So next in the process, we held a series of partner workshops, which I'll get into more detail in a couple slides, that really turned that shared vision into action. So during these workshops, working groups developed strategies and actions for each goal, making sure they were practical and informed by both technical expertise and on-the-ground experience. And again, this planning process was meant to be iterative, meaning we were regularly gathering partner feedback and refining those strategies and actions along the way. We're now kind of in the final stages of developing this plan, and we're going to have partner review pretty soon. So those of you who are partners in the room, you should be expecting that pretty soon, and we'll be finalizing the plan for public by midsummer. Okay. So with that planning process in mind, this slide highlights the partners who have been helping make this work possible. I just want to raise of hands, how many of you have been involved in the Sentinel landscape? That's quite a bit. That's awesome. So thank you for your time and participation. I know it's been a lot, but we really appreciate it. So that's one of the biggest strengths that the Great Salt Lake Sentinel landscape has, is its broad partnership network. This initiative brings together federal, state, local, tribal, and private partners, and this helps align natural resource conservation and national defense priorities across different jurisdictions and different land ownerships. This kind of multi-agency collaboration is a key part of the Sentinel landscape model and allows partners to work together across the entire landscape. And as Marisa mentioned, as of May 2026, so now, there's a total of 50 partners actively involved in the Sentinel landscape efforts. The partners highlighted here are just a few. It's really hard to fit 50 logos on a slide. And these kind of represent some of the key Great Salt Lake focused participants that are helping with those actions. Okay. Again, kind of a highlight of this presentation is really to highlight all the collaboration that has gone on to develop this implementation plan. I don't know how many of you have been involved in many planning processes, but partner input is so crucial to making a plan that will actually go into action. If you only have a small set of hands on it, you're definitely going to miss certain things. There's so much knowledge in this room, so much knowledge across all the partners that are involved with this. Marisa really set that up well. And she kind of started this well before SWCA was even contracted, setting up, regular meetings with the executive and steering committees and the working groups to kind of start brainstorming actions and strategies for this implementation plan before SWCA was even brought on. After SWCA was brought on, we helped facilitate numerous working group meetings and annual partner meeting, which held place back in December. And the purpose of the working groups meetings were, again, to provide technical input on those proposed strategies and actions. And this step kind of produced our first draft of those strategies and actions for each goal. At the annual partners meeting, it was a nice in-person meeting down at Hill Air Force Base. And this was kind of a time for everyone to come together. It introduced folks, again, to the Sentinel landscape. Again, this is pretty new, so kind of introduced the partners to what the goals and priorities were. And then we had a 2-hour workshop during that meeting where we broke into working groups and kind of took those draft strategies and actions and tried to identify gaps and strengthen alignment and refine those. After this, we decided we needed some more work with the working groups, and we did some online workshops and used a Zoom whiteboard and kind of did interactive exercises to really build out those actions. So we wanted to, identify the key partners who would be working on each of those actions, metrics to measure success, define the schedule and possible funding options for each action. And this really helped move the plan from a general framework to a more implementation-ready roadmap. Okay, so with that background on the planning process, I'm gonna just talk very briefly about one of the goals. Like Marisa mentioned, there's a total of 4 goals, all focused on different things. We don't have time to dive into each of those. So we'll kind of keep focused on just goal 4, which is kind of most relevant to this conference and this group today. And it focuses on protecting and improving water resources in the Great Salt Lake ecosystem in response to declining lake levels, competing water demands, and watershed degradation. Kind of a common theme, I think, from this presentation. Many of these actions under this goal are already being implemented or planned by partners across the basin. Again, the Sentinel landscape efforts builds on that work by improving coordination, supporting funding opportunities, and bringing greater visibility to these efforts. Overall, the goal is to align conservation, restoration, and monitoring activities across the basin to improve water management and support increased inflows to the lake. And the long-term outcome that we hope and expect is a more connected system that strengthens watershed health, supports resilient communities and military installations, and improves decision-making through better coordination and shared information. So a key strategy under Goal 4 is really improving coordination and planning across the Great Salt Lake Basin. Again, this is a plan by partners for partners, so all of these actions were generated by folks in this room or folks that you work with. But one of the main priorities that were brought up is really aligning major planning efforts so partners are working from a shared vision to support inflows to the lake. This helps reduce duplication and ensures that conservation and water management actions are reinforcing each other across agencies and all the different plans that are going on. Another focus that was brought up is expanding water resilience planning at military installations. This helps support long-term mission readiness while also aligning with broader watershed priorities. The plan also emphasizes, enhancing basin-wide data sharing so agencies, water users, and decision makers have better access to consistent information when making those water management decisions. In addition, the plan really focuses on looking at ways that the Sentinel landscape can leverage funding opportunities for actions such as water leases, restoration projects, and other efforts that can increase inflows to the lake. So while those strategies and actions focused on coordination and planning, there's also a series of actions that partners brought up that are more on the ground, improving conditions to support Great Salt Lake water quantity and water quality. These efforts also help strengthen the long-term resilience, again, of the communities and nearby military installations. So a major emphasis for partners is, again, expanding wet, meadow, and wetland restoration projects. I don't think I need to tell this group why that is important. Another important part of that restoration is invasive species management. That's also been discussed quite a bit throughout this conference. But the partners really think that, both around the Great Salt Lake and the tributaries, invasive species such as Phragmites, Russian olives, and tamarisk, are reducing water availability and impacting ecosystem health. So that's a focused action. We've also highlighted the need to strengthen water monitoring networks and data infrastructure so we can better understand water availability across the basin and support more informed water management decisions. And then this is also really important, particularly for the installations and for broader communities, but maintaining those water levels in the Great Salt Lake is really important for reducing dust emissions from exposed lake beds, which many of us think about, affecting regional water quality or air quality, but this also really affects military training conditions. Finally, this plan also includes actions that aim to address water quality challenges, helping ensure that water reaching the Great Salt Lake supports long-term ecosystem health, regional resilience, and continued readiness of military installations that depend on these water resources. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Marisa to wrap this up.
All right, I know we're short on time, but I think this is the slide everyone kind of wants to know the most about. How on earth is the Sentinel landscape going to benefit Great Salt Lake? So first and foremost, what sets us apart from all the Great Salt Lake acronyms that you see floating around, GSLSL, we bring partners together, disparate partners together in a creative and collaborative framework. So you probably didn't know the extent to which our military installations actually care about Great Salt Lake and they want to be involved. And so the Sentinel landscape is an amazing opportunity to collaborate with partners that you would ordinarily never work with. Secondly, the Sentinel landscape adds an additional layer of importance to the work that we're already doing. Through this partnership, Great Salt Lake is now linked to national security and defense. That's huge. Our Great Salt Lake, or our military will struggle without a healthy Great Salt Lake. And so this lens can really help us advance our shared priorities and unify large-scale conservation across additional jurisdictions. So you're also probably wondering, Sentinel landscapes don't come with a funding package. Of course, they come with me. But rather, we receive priority access to certain, thank you for laughing, priority access to certain funding opportunities, such as REPI, which is the Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program with the Department of War. You'll hear me say that a lot. These funding opportunities are new to Great Salt Lake, and because of our Sentinel landscape designation, we're already pulling in these Department of War dollars to help improve our watershed. And it's not just Department of War dollars that we can tap into. It's state, federal, local, private, the whole gambit. And so lastly, having a Sentinel landscape here in Utah broadens our national connections. So if you think back to that slide with all 19 Sentinel landscapes spread around the country, being a part of this large nationwide network of partnerships that are approaching issues in the same ways as us is a way for us to bring in new resources and creative solutions to Great Salt Lake. And so quickly, we're almost done with the plan. It'll be published this July, and then beyond that, again, we're going to be adaptive, flexible, nimble, creative, and reanalyze as we go. And the plan is intended to be redone or edited every 5 years, but we can do it before that too. And so, as we already know, Great Salt Lake heavily depends on our partnership. The Great Salt Lake Sentinel landscape does not intend to add additional workload. It intends to build upon the work that's already underway by bridging gaps, bringing in new resources, new partners, and make connections. And there's no shortage of work that we can do together now that we have this amazing designation. And then on top of that, you can go home to your families tonight and say, you know, Great Salt Lake has an importance beyond what you thought its value was. It's now linked to defense and national security. So the people that weren't interested before, hopefully they care now. That's the thought. And so thank you again to Friends of Great Salt Lake for having us. The QR code there links to our website. You also are free to come talk to me. I'm happy to show you the way. So thanks again. Oh, I don't know if we have time for questions, do we? Oh, okay, I guess there's time for a question.
Hello. You mentioned that this project got started kind of sprung out of a concern for like encroaching development toward military installations. Am I being magnified?
I can hear you.
Okay. I was curious what is meant by, I mean, this is kind of a two-part question. I was curious what's meant by incompatible development specifically, and then Hill Air Force Base is located kind of in a pretty densely populated area. So I was wondering if this plan will have any bearing on housing density going forward.
Amazing questions, both of them. So when I say incompatible development, it'll change depending on the military installation, the service, and what their specific mission requirements are. I'll speak to Hill Air Force Base specifically because they are an Air Force base. They fly a lot of planes. If you ever hang out in Layton or Ogden, you've definitely heard one of the jets fly by. They're really loud. And so you obviously can't have buildings that are above a certain height. Additionally, there's a safety concern. They've had issues with jets that have crashed. You don't want houses right up to where those jets are taking off and landing. And so incompatible can mean a lot of different things, but for Hill specifically, they want development to, should there be an accident, which we obviously don't want to happen, we want people to be safe. And secondly, yes, if you look at the map of Hill Air Force Base, it is a bit alarming to see how much development has grown around the installation. There's obviously not much we can do with the development that's already there, but Hill Air Force Base has two REPI, I'd say that again, REPI project areas that are along the northern and southern terminuses of their runway. And we're actively working with partners on permanent land protections in those areas. When we do work with private landowners, I also want to mention that everything is entirely voluntary. We're non-regulatory, no federal oversight here. We work with willing landowners and willing partners on these shared goals and outcomes. So hopefully that answered your question. Thank you. Thank you.